Welcome back, party people. Mike here with The Social Life of Language, and today we are covering my newest article, Semiotic Whitening, Whiteness Without White People, just published in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology. If you want to listen to the whole article, I read it out loud right here on YouTube. Link is at the top corner. So there are two big things going on here. There's the theoretical approach I call semiotic whitening, but today we're just going to call it whitening. And then there's the political agenda, which directly critiques our bad habit of referring to whiteness as invisible, or the technical term is unmarked. Because it's been my experience as a non-white person that I can see white stuff pretty easily. I mean, think of all the times you've heard a person of color say, "Oh, that's white people stuff." Today we'll be talking about being able to see whiteness or white stuff. Not white people, but whiteness. And I'm going to start this video with a crazy statement. You ready? Whiteness is not and never has been universally or even just generally invisible. Just because specific groups of people and individuals are less aware of whiteness and white supremacy, that does not mean people in general are unaware of whiteness and white supremacy. To show this, I look at how a non-white population, Mexican Americans in South Texas, they were often so aware of whiteness, they learned how to use signs of whiteness strategically. And this is done through the process of whitening. In this research, we are focusing on how that white stuff is created, specifically looking at moments of whitening a person's name. Historically, Latinxes have had a huge problem of folks anglicizing our names. Because in the United States, if your name isn't recognizable as English, the norm has generally been, oh well, who cares, just force English onto it anyway. Now, when this happens in a classroom to a Latinx person, many of us see that as culture being stripped away from us. For example, let's say my name is Pedro and I'm Mexican, but you decide without my permission to change my name to Pete. We might tend to think of that as subtracting away our culture, subtracting the signs of my ethnic and racial identity. However, what if we think about this in a different way? Instead of focusing on the subtraction of signs, I'm going to focus on how people are forced to add whiteness or add signs of white culture to their Mexican Spanish language name. But to be super clear about this, both addition and subtraction of signs are always happening at the same time. But I've noticed that we tend to often focus on the subtraction of racial signs. The big nerdy word that we commonly use is deracialization, as in the deduction of racial signs. On the other hand, I like to focus on re-racialization, as in the addition of racial signs, which then has the potential to change the racial meaning of something. In today's video, we are looking at how racial meanings are added in and how they become relevant in naming practices, specifically when a Mexican identifying person's Spanish language name is whitened. We generally say that our name is anglicized, but that's kind of just another word for whitening, isn't it? Now, here's the twist. The Mexican Americans in South Texas that I'm looking at have started willingly whitening their names. But aren't Latinxes supposed to be really against this practice? So what's happening here? And if we approach this stuff as examples of addition, as in the adding in of white racial meanings, what can that tell us about how race works? All good questions. Let's find out. Okay, before we get started, I know that certain people in the audience will not be convinced at how obvious whiteness can actually be. But in South Texas, all we gotta do is look at history. We're in a region of deep South Texas that was colonized several times by Spain, by Mexico, by the Republic of Texas, the Southern Confederacy, and eventually the larger United States. Then you had Mexicans living through a special local version of Jim Crow called Juan Crow. So you had lynchings in the area, you had massacres, and yes, in South Texas, you had the white terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan. We should also consider the various moments of mass deportation. Then you fast forward to the 2020s, and in this region of South Texas, you have immigrant detention camps. You got the big border wall, and of course, the racist president that loves the border wall. After all of that, is it really so difficult to believe that the local Mexicans perceive themselves as something different and separate from whiteness? So this appears to be a special set of unfortunate racial circumstances, and clearly a reason why local Mexicans are vividly aware of whiteness. That's the thing, it only appears to be a special set of racial circumstances. But if we really think about it, the ability to see whiteness is not some kind of superpower to racialized folks. It's a requirement. If you are a person of color in a white supremacist society, it's dangerous not to pay attention to how whiteness works. So when folks say that whiteness is invisible, or maybe they'll say the technical phrase which says whiteness is unmarked, I'm like, okay, let's be way more specific right now. Invisible to who and when and where? Because a whole lot of people of color would never say whiteness is invisible, including this guy right here. And it's not because I'm a race theorist with a PhD, it's because I live in the United States and have common sense. Now, white supremacist beliefs make up what we usually call the white gaze, or a way to interpret the world that privileges the behaviors and cultural norms of idealized white people. Notice I said idealized white people, not real white people, but more like imaginary, perfectly behaved white people whose behaviors are assumed to be the normal or right way to act. And if you interpret the world through the white gaze by constantly comparing everything to the imaginary perfect behavior of imaginary perfect white folks, then you'll tend to use that comparison to decide whether or not something is normal or not normal and deviant or just wrong. For example, the white gaze might interpret a dark-skinned person that's wearing a hoodie as deviant, literally as a deviant, or a potential criminal. Now just imagine a police officer that assumes hoodies worn by dark-skinned individuals are automatically more suspicious or dangerous or potentially a criminal. You can guess that in that situation, the guns are gonna come out faster. The white gaze can get you killed. And that's exactly part of what makes whiteness so easy to see from certain perspectives. Okay, time out for a quick side note so that I can really clarify something. Because I'm not trying to imply that you shouldn't trust white identifying people in general. Just because a person is white identifying, that does not automatically mean that they see the world through the white gaze. Everyone's different. Now, with that said, just because you are non-white identifying, that doesn't make you automatically immune from using the white gaze. In fact, this whole video is about how POCs might use the white gaze on purpose and strategically. So there are two perspectives important to this video. Yes, the white gaze, but also the local gaze from the perspective of Mexican Americans who live in South Texas, who perceive themselves as something different from idealized white people, as different from idealized white cultural norms. Today, this region is about 91% Mexican heritage folks. I was actually born and raised in this region, and I can tell you that talking about white folks was super common. If you're not from there, you'll notice really quickly how Mexican Americans tend to talk about white folks as coming from up north, or people not from here, or people from up there, as in not from South Texas. And those white folks are imagined to live and think very differently from local Mexican folks. So what we have here are two oppositional gazes, two oppositional perspectives, a white gaze worldview and the local Mexican worldview. And knowing that you live in a white supremacist society means that you will need to consider both perspectives when figuring out whether or not something has to do with race, especially when we're adding racial meanings together. In fact, let's talk about that now, how we might approach this idea of the addition of racial signs. Now, keep in mind, when we add signs together, something more and something new comes out as an effect. In other words, when you add meanings together, you create more meanings. In the same way, if you add racial meanings together, you give rise to more racial meanings. Quick side note for the ultra nerdy people in the audience, specifically the semiotics folks out there, all I'm doing is adjusting that main Peircean principle we all know. Signs give rise to signs. Or my version, racialized signs give rise to more racialized signs. So let's do a slow walkthrough of a concrete example of adding signs together, adding racial meanings together. And let's look at how a hoodie becomes a sign of racial criminality from the perspective of the white gaze. Because it's not automatic. You gotta add the signs together. On TV, and specifically the news, you see folks talk about how people, especially dark skin-toned teenage boys and men, they should just know that people will be suspicious of them every time they wear a hoodie.
You have to recognize that this whole stylizing yourself as a gangster, you're going to be a gangster wannabe, well, people are going to perceive you as a menace.
Then we had that whole counter movement of white college students who critiqued the white gaze. And they showed that actually no one saw them as dangerous. No one considered white skin tones in a hoodie as automatically dangerous. So what's happening here? Remember, when meanings are added together, new meanings emerge. For example, from the white gaze perspective, dark skin plus hoodie gives you criminality. But also from the white gaze perspective, white skin plus hoodie does not give you a potential criminal. But maybe it means something else, like it's cold outside. So when we add meanings together, we create new meanings, new interpretations. Now here's the complicated twist. In real life, we are always dealing with more than just a hoodie and a skin tone. We have to consider the wider environment, the wider context. Because remember, we are thinking about meanings where signs add up in a certain way, and that includes the environmental signs. Okay, that sounds complicated, but it ain't. We just forget that we're doing it sometimes. So in this last step, let's put our hoodie wearer in an environment, and then let's see what happens when we add in more environmental signs. Let's just say we got a dark-skinned guy wearing a hoodie with a Harvard logo on it, and that person is sitting in a Harvard classroom. In that context, the idea of criminality is way less likely to emerge because we gotta add in more meanings. We gotta add in the environmental signs. So yes, you got dark skin plus a hoodie, but we also gotta add in all the larger meanings of the environment, all the larger meanings and norms of the university campus itself, where Harvard hoodies are expected to be worn by students on colder days, or maybe if they're an athlete. The signs and meanings added up to something else, probably Harvard student. But let's just say that exact same dark-skinned student with a Harvard hoodie was walking at night through an elite white neighborhood. Will they still be read as a university student or as something else? What do you think? So you see, the environmental signs can change everything. In fact, later on, we're going to talk about an example where the environmental signs were so intensely white that it made it possible for someone to pass as racially white, even though they were Mexican. So my article and this video is all about how racial meanings are added together, but also I'm concerned with how they add up differently depending on which perspective you see the world through, because it changes. For example, from the perspective of a racialized parent who has a teenager who always wears hoodies, dark skin plus hoodie probably equals something like, my child is cold. And here's yet another level, and let's be really, really honest here. That mom or dad will very likely be fully aware of the white gaze interpretation that says, criminals wear hoodies. Because parents know that if a police officer is using the white gaze, it just makes it all the more likely that their child will be killed. In South Texas, people were so aware of whiteness and white supremacy that it created the possibility for local Mexicans to learn how to add white racial meanings in very specific ways, sometimes to manipulate white supremacy, and sometimes they accidentally reproduced white supremacy. Now, I concentrate on names and nicknames, mainly because we know a lot of race stuff happens here, especially when a name is perceived as foreign or not English. And this has been a major issue to Latinxes in the United States, because in American education, the norm is, if a name is not in English, who cares? Force English onto it. That practice, to this day, is considered normative and normal, or just the way things are. But calling that practice normal and normative discounts every single perspective that considers that practice insulting or embarrassing or harmful. Look, it's not normal and normative just because specific individuals describe it that way. But there was another major twist in my research. In this area, and to these Latinx college students I was working with, they would intentionally anglicize their own names and nicknames. Or to use my term, they whitened their names. For example, my name is Gabriela, but call me Gabby. Or my name is Guadalupe, but call me Gigi. Or my name is Ana, but I like it pronounced Anna, like in English. So up next, we are gonna get to see how signs add up in a certain way to create whitened interpretations of local social practices. Specifically, how people use names. First, we gotta know that in South Texas, it does appear that the local population is trending toward names that are more and more easily recognizable as being in English or as American names. For example, my own name, Mike. My sister's name is Hillary. But also, like I said, if a person has a name in Spanish, a lot of locals use English language versions of their own names and nicknames. To me, this is not just assimilation. It's something more than that. Part of the inspiration for this article includes the semi-fictional, semi-autobiographical book George Washington Gomez, written by Americo Paredes in the 1930s and in the exact same South Texas region. The story took place in the 1900s and tells the story of a boy named George Washington Gomez. If you look at why his family chose that name for him, you come to find out that they wanted to name him after a great white man, the most American man of all American men, President George Washington. The family chose that name because the baby was born with light skin and blue eyes, so they thought that maybe he might be able to walk among the gringos, walk among the white folks as an equal, free from racism, if he just had the right name. So instead of naming the child after a father or a grandfather or something super traditional like that, they chose a name that was linked to the history of American whiteness. Not just the English name George by itself, but the full name George Washington, a name that carries a massive amount of heavy history, what we might describe as historical weight. This is a very clear example of whitening, where a set of signs and meanings known to be linked to whiteness are added in order to whiten stuff. We might say light skin plus blue eyes plus historical white name gives you, hopefully, a person that could pass as white. Clearly, this family knows how to deploy signs traditionally interpreted as white, and they are clearly trying to strategically manipulate white supremacist ideologies to give their own child a strategic advantage in life. In this case, the whitening was very intentional and very strategic. But does this happen in real life? Now, if we flash forward to today-ish, the 2020s, I was seeing all these Mexican students using English translations of their names and nicknames. And I started wondering, are we still employing whitening strategies to try to get ahead in life? Or maybe it's not that deep. Maybe folks are just whitening their names out of convenience. Well, the truth is, there were multiple reasons why a person might whiten their name. And those reasons changed from context to context, from environment to environment. But one thing was consistent to all the people that I interviewed about this. They were absolutely aware that the unfolding of any scenario could be massively altered just by whether or not they presented their name in Spanish or in English. Up next, we get to the good stuff. I'm going to walk you through 3 different examples from South Texas so that we see whitening in action. Now, the title to the original article is Semiotic Whitening, Whiteness Without White People, of which I mean that the white gaze perspective does not require the actual presence of white people. However, that doesn't mean that there were absolutely no white people in South Texas. In fact, there are a few, but locally, folks call them either winter Texans or snowbirds, meaning that these are older folks that migrate to South Texas during the winter months to escape the cold of the northern states. So in this region of South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, you got all these old white folks walking around, almost always upper class, retired, and Republican. And winter Texans tend to live in these high-end mobile home parks that are reserved specifically for them as seasonal visitors. Useless side note, want to know a funny semi-sorta racially inflected slur that local Mexicans call these winter Texans? Well, sometimes the locals refer to them as Q-tips. Cause, well, you know, someone even wrote a book about South Texas titled The Q-Tip Invasion. So interacting with white folks in South Texas very often means you're talking to one of these winter Texans. I've known many of these folks, and very generally they're super polite, and most of them will claim to love Hispanic culture. Unfortunately, their idea of Hispanic culture is full of racial stereotypes. For example, I've heard many winter Texans express the idea that Mexicans don't care about education because they've had really hard lives and many are poor and they need to work. Okay, so you can kind of hear the sympathy in what they're trying to say, I guess, but the assumption that Mexicans in general don't care about education, well, that is just the white gaze put into words. That is white supremacist stereotypes about uneducated, unintelligent Mexicans. Notice from my local Mexican perspective, I can see the white supremacist stereotypes like that. But from an external, non-local, white gaze perspective, that statement might sound nice or caring or even empathetic to other folks that also see the world through the white gaze. So in this first example, I had one participant who interacted frequently with these winter Texans at his job as an optician. So he's the dude that helps folks buy eyeglasses. And it's his job to know all the sciencey technology stuff behind glasses. So here is a pretty straightforward example of whitening your own name out of convenience. His name was Humberto, and that was on his name tag. He said, quote, "I work with a lot of winter Texans. Many come down to Texas. And they're like, thank you for your help, bear. And I say, bear, toe is fine. Please don't try." End quote. In this scenario where he's dealing with non-Spanish speaking white folks, he invents a pronunciation for convenience. He knows they will mess up his name, so he's like, please don't try. And when he's out in public, he often uses the nickname Herbie just to avoid this kind of thing. But how do we know that Humberto relates English names to whiteness? Well, because he said it, but it came out later when he was talking about his interactions with monolingual Spanish-speaking clientele. Now, because his name is Humberto, the Spanish-speaking clientele would just assume that he must know Spanish. So here's the interesting part. Humberto was totally bilingual, but he was not confident in his Spanish, specifically when it came to the big sciencey words. Like, for example, how would you translate polycarbonate progressive eyeglass lenses? Unfortunately, the Spanish-speaking locals would generally go straight to him because his Spanish name was perceived as super Mexican. Therefore, he must know Spanish. But like he said, quote, "Please do not be fooled by the name on this badge. I am very white inside." End quote. So that's a complex statement, but on a basic level, he is highlighting stereotypes about Latinxes automatically knowing Spanish. He also goes further and connects English speaking to whiteness. So in this case, the English sounds hum, bear, toe, those sounds are treated like white racial signs. So again, it does appear that this person knows exactly how the white gaze works and can add in white racial signs to accommodate. And now on to the second example. There was another participant named Jose Martinez who did not like his own name because he believed it was so common that it made him susceptible to the most common racist stereotypes. And we even joked about what would happen if he translated his name Jose to Joe, or even to Joseph. Now, Jose was very concerned about putting his name on job applications. He said, quote, "People might see that name, Jose Martinez, and they'll probably associate it with obviously with being Mexican, maybe with being uneducated, or with being poor, or with being illegal even," end quote. Well, what can I say? He's absolutely correct. There is indisputable research showing that racial profiling happens to names when written on job applications, especially if your name is perceived as too Mexican or too black. Okay, this last example is my favorite because it involves a person who gets so many signs of whiteness added to them that they actually became white, as in, it made it possible for them to pass as white. To understand this example, I want to approach whitening in a simple but metaphorical way. Specifically, this idea of heaviness, as in, the more we add racial meanings and racial signs together, the heavier and heavier they become. And to me, the heavier the racial signs get when we add them together, the more easily we can sense that metaphorical weight, which means it becomes all the more likely that we begin to see something as racial or having to do with race. We gotta consider how some racial signs are already super heavy, because some signs carry a huge amount of historical racial baggage. An easy example of a heavy sign would be something like a person's skin tone. I think most of us believe that skin tones have a lot of powerful meanings. Or to use the metaphor, skin tones are heavy racial signs exactly because they carry a lot of powerful racial meanings. What's also interesting to think about is considering what happens when really heavy signs get added to lighter signs. Lighter signs that we don't necessarily see as a racial sign by itself. Side note here, by the way, this metaphor of heavy signs was inspired by racio-semiotic scholar Crystal Smalls. If you don't know who she is, you get your life together, and you can start with this video that I made on one of her articles. Okay, let's make this heaviness metaphor really clear with an example of adding signs together that are different weights, just so we can see what happens. And let's bring back the hoodie example. Let's start with white skin. Remember, skin tones are already heavy signs because to understand what skin tones mean, we have to add in all of this historical baggage, all the historical signs related to white skin tones. Okay, next part. Let's add the hoodie onto the white skin tone, and that will probably give you white hoodie wearer. Now, notice that even together, the weight of the white skin tone added to the weight of the hoodie, that does not actually become heavier with racial signs. But why not? Well, the hoodie by itself is not really a racial sign. It's a piece of clothing first. But even when we add in the white body, the white skin tone to the hoodie, notice how there just isn't this big collection of historical signs and stereotypes related to white hoodie wearers. All those racial stereotypes simply do not exist. And if those racial stereotypes don't exist, then we don't really have any extra racial weight to add in. So it appears in this case that the racial weight of the signs don't really increase much further than just what white skin tone means. So the most likely interpretation of the white hoodie wearer would probably be that white person in the hoodie is keeping warm because it's cold outside, or whatever. On the other hand, let's switch out white skin for dark skin, and suddenly the weight of the signs add up totally differently. Let's break it down. We can start with a dark skin tone. And because since we're dealing with dark skin, we can expect all those heavy racial stereotypes to be overwhelmingly negative. Okay, next, let's add in the hoodie. And now we got a dark skin toned hoodie wearer. Now together, that hoodie just got extremely heavy with racial signs. But why? Well, because now we have to add in all the historical racial meanings and signs and racist stereotypes about dark-skinned folks who wear hoodies. And like I've said, the heavier the set of signs, the more likely it is that we sense something racial is happening. We sense the racial weight. This simple metaphor is only to help us understand what is happening. Now, I already said earlier that these assumptions about hoodies are from the perspective of the white gaze, which is informed by white supremacist beliefs. But remember, from a racialized parent's perspective who reject white supremacist beliefs, their dark-skinned teenager in a hoodie is not a potential criminal, but probably just means my child feels cold. That would mean the parent's perspective is not dominated by the white gaze perspective. They see and interpret the world in a different way, from an oppositional perspective, where the signs add up differently. Not only that, the racial signs themselves probably have different weights. They might be heavier or lighter, depending on what perspective you see the world through. With this last and third example, we meet a participant named Joan, and we're gonna see how signs added up together in just the right way from the white gaze, and this allowed her to pass as racially white. Her full name is Joan Lynn Garcia. Notice the names Joan and Lynn look like English, while Garcia looks like Spanish. Joan spoke about the way she would visit winter Texans in their mobile home parks when she was a reporter for the local newspaper. Joan will tell you herself that she can be mistaken for a white person based on how she looks. So she has light skin, light eyes, and light brown hair. And if you don't know that her last name is Garcia, you'd probably think that she's white with the names Joan and Lynn, which locally are very not traditional Mexican names. Here's what she said. "It's really interesting being in the valley looking the way that I do. I've always had all the privileges of a white person. I would go to a lot of Winter Texans events, and Winter Texans are the majority of them are white. So it's weird because them only knowing my first name, they assume that I'm white. So when they think they're alone and they think they're only surrounded by white people, they'll say things to me, around me, that I don't think they would say if they knew I was Hispanic." End quote. Okay, let's think through how she became white by adding the racial signs together. She was already carrying several heavy racial signs. She had light skin, light eyes, light hair, plus an American/English first and middle name. But also remember that you have to add in the signs from the context, the environmental signs. In this particular case, some of the environmental signs included all the white bodies, the entirely white space, and the presence of white cultures. All of those heavy racial signs together created an environment overflowing with the weight of whiteness, which in turn led to the total whitening of Joan. Now, Joan knew that these folks perceived her as white, because all that casual racism about Mexicans and Hispanics probably wouldn't be happening if they knew she was Mexican. This is a perfect example of how visible whiteness can be. Let's pull apart the two separate perspectives in this event, in this environment. There was the white gaze, what the winter Texans were seeing the world through, and then there was the local Mexican perspective, what Joan saw the world through. The white gaze added up the signs in such a way that people perceived Joan as white, and therefore everyone in the room was white. And therefore it became a safe space to say all this racist crap about Mexicans. And here comes a major point. In my opinion, it would be kinda dumb to describe whiteness as invisible from Joan's perspective. She knew exactly what was going on and why it was happening the whole time. Must I say it again? Whiteness is not invisible. Then again, I do wonder about those winter Texans. I'm wondering if you could make the case that whiteness was invisible to those specific winter Texans? Could they really be so unaware of their whiteness? Well, I tend to agree with Joan. If they knew a Mexican person was in the room, they would not be making those racist statements about Mexicans. And why wouldn't they? Oh, that's a simple one. White identifying people see whiteness too. It's just that part of the problem is way too many white folks pretend like they can't see it. But still, I'm wondering, is it possible for whiteness to be temporarily invisible from within the white gaze, where the signs of the environment add up in just the right way so that white racial signs are momentarily forgotten about or pushed aside as not that important, even just for a little bit, just for a few minutes, maybe the length of a conversation or something? Is that possible? Well, in my opinion, yeah, that is possible. But notice, I'm not making this grand claim that whiteness is generally invisible. We aren't saying people generally can't see whiteness. Instead, we are placing limitations on that supposed invisibility to a specific and narrow worldview, the worldview we call the white gaze. And just as importantly, we are also limiting that invisibility to a very specific environment. Not all environments in general, but very specific environments with specific signs that add up in a specific way from within a specific perspective that we've been calling the white gaze. Describing the unmarkedness of whiteness or the invisibility of whiteness like that, yeah, that's something I'm totally okay with because we're not even coming close to making any kind of universal claim about whiteness. Bottom line here, and I'll say it bluntly because it's more fun that way, all I'm saying is don't be suggesting to me that whiteness is invisible from all Latinx perspectives and all Black perspectives, and all indigenous perspectives, etc., etc., etc. I mean, come on, isn't that proposition kind of absurd? In my opinion, that whole generalized invisibility of whiteness, that idea is a white supremacist lie that a lot of us help perpetuate. I'm going to end today with the very last lines of the original article, just so you can kind of get the attitude of the article and maybe you'll be more interested in reading the original. I say, quote, James Baldwin characterized the formation of whiteness and the entailed white supremacist ideologies as a process of adding lies onto even more lies. Lies that chip away, eventually sculpting a compelling and alternative truth. But not everyone accepts that truth. Far from whiteness being characterized as uniformly invisible or rational or modern, to subordinated populations, white persons were often characterized as barbaric, as people to be feared, and as terrorists. Perhaps then, we might consider how the invisibility of whiteness is only as true as the foundation of myths it was built upon. This video then puts that truth in question. Well, that's all for today, folks. You can download this article for free from maestromikemena.com or academia.edu. I want to send a special thanks to my Patreon supporters. I was finally able to purchase this cinema camera, and it was all with your help. Once again, I'm Dr. Mike, and you've been watching The Social Life of Language. And we're done.
In a world with invisible white people, one man dared to say otherwise. Read what critics are calling a destructive work. Pure Antifa propaganda. Already banned in Florida for being too woke. Semiotic whitening. Whiteness without white people.